This is Dan Kostka. I recently met with Ryan McAuley at the Doorway at their location in southeast Calgary. And I started our conversation by asking him how long he had been with the Doorway.
I have been with the Doorway now for almost 7 months. Started in March. March 1st, actually. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, very beginning of the month. Yeah.
And what did you know about the place before you came here?
What I knew about the Doorway before I came here was kind of the my plan portion. So the idea of giving people small amounts of cash for writing down, setting their goals, talking about their goals, stuff like that. So that was basically what I knew about it, like coming into it. And I really liked that idea because of working with people before, it just basically been that it was our responsibility as the social worker or as the employee or whatever you want to call it to basically like motivate and control and push people to set goals and to go and like achieve them and kind of like do everything in our power to make sure that happened, which I don't think is like terrible to have somebody who's on your team and will help you whenever you need it. But I started to view a lot of people as not being able to create that motivation for themselves, and it wasn't their goal because it was more about for employees to meet certain expectations, and so they would push really hard, and it was never really that person's goal. It was just more like something that they were told they should do, but they didn't really want to do it. And so I loved the My Plan idea because I was like, well, you're getting an incentive for thinking about this, but you are consistently thinking about what you might want to do in your life. And I think that's really powerful that you're thinking about it, that you're writing down some steps to get there, and eventually you might actually do it. But the idea was like that process would be your own. And I really like that idea of it being like your own journey and not having somebody try and control it for you.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So that was what I knew about it, was the money.
Yeah.
And some of those other things. I was like, okay, I like that idea. I like that concept. That's cool. So,
yeah, it's what sets it apart, right? Like it's not typical. And so you've been in helping roles before, in other roles where you've helped people?
Yeah, totally. I've been doing social work for probably about, like social work, quote unquote, for probably about 5 years. Before that, I was actually in pastoral work, and I also worked with children. I guess I was at a before and after school program when I was in university, and even before university. So lots of like quote unquote helping people, I guess, throughout the adult life.
Right. And so you said you've done pastoral work, so your faith is also what brought you to social work?
Kinda. Well, it was more that I enjoyed doing pastoral work, but then I decided I didn't agree with the tenets of Christianity anymore.
Oh.
But I still really wanted to help people in some way, shape, or form. And so social work kind of seemed like a natural transition to continuing that. But I think even when I was in church, I felt like there was a real disconnect, I think, between like kind of the people in church and then kind of this other world that I was observing, which is kind of like the street culture. And so I always kind of had more of a heart for that anyway. And I always kind of wrestled with the tension between people who are more part of mainstream or people who are more like normative, and then this other side of things. I would just go down to the streets like by myself and just hand out granola bars to people and just...
You're doing that on your own initiative?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I would just like, at that point, I would just pray with them or just hang out with them. But a lot of it was selfish on some level because I was just much more interested in that world than the world I was kind of currently existing in, you know? So, yeah, I always kind of had that heart for it. I always thought it was really interesting. I always would kind of be bringing up that conversation with people. But then, like, once I wasn't in the church anymore, I was like, oh, I can just go do this now. Like, I don't really have to, I can do this for a job as opposed to having to balance that with, like, other people, I guess, and other people's needs. So.
Oh, wow. Yeah. You're getting away from some of the structure that you didn't fit with, but you were trying to do things like go directly to people in need. Like what Jesus would do in actuality is go to the people, hang out around the people most in need who are maybe shunned by mainstream society or whatever.
Yes.
And just be there with them and you know, it's not like Jesus in his lifetime would have had to, he didn't have the structure on him. He had an informal group of disciples and whatever, but
totally.
he was just with the people who are on the outside of society, outside of mainstream society.
Totally.
So does that cross your mind sometimes, that you're trying to emulate his life even as you're rejecting the structures that have been built around his life since then? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. That's a really good question. Yeah, I think that's definitely what motivated me initially, for sure, was like the character I saw like in the Gospels.
Yeah.
For me, did not line up nearly as much as what I was seeing in my church. And that wasn't to judge like people, because I really like a lot of aspects of like church culture. Like I grew up in it and I have like really fond memories. And I think there's like something that's really beautiful about that as well. But I think in terms of like the gospel, it was like difficult for me to kind of reconcile that, because that's what I saw in the character of Jesus, was like he's going out into the streets, he's like hanging out with people that other people wouldn't hang out with, you know, and those people also seem much more compelling. And I think part of it in some ways is because like those people just have so much a better understanding of their own like humanity and their own like ability to fail and make mistakes and get entrenched in like some of the darker things of life. You know, you can kind of see it in people's eyes, like they've been through it. You know, they understand what that's like, and I just kind of felt like I saw those kind of eternal realities playing out a lot more, like it was a lot more explicit, I guess, like on the streets of just like you're living day by day. You're not really sure. You're not necessarily sure like where your next meal will come from, like where that will be. You're not really sure what tomorrow's going to look like. You're having to trust maybe in your community, but at that point I was kind of more like, oh, a lot of people on the streets are like religious, or they seem very spiritual. And I was like, well, of course, like like you're living day by day. And that's what Jesus talked a lot about, was like just trusting in him, trusting in God, like every single day to provide and kind of make it through. And so I just felt like it just felt like the gospel was like more alive on the streets. And I think as time has gone on, I'm a little more like, oh, there's like a lot of darkness, and I wouldn't necessarily like want to be a part of that. But I found it really interesting. And so I think like now, I think there was never really a rejection of that character of Jesus. It was more like a rejection of a lot of things around that. There's a lot of other difficulties for sure, but I still find that like really interesting. And I still think that like I still think that I want to live my life in a way that like is congruent with that character, for sure.
But
for sure.
I think it's fair to say we live in a cynical time where people question motives and don't trust each other. They put each other in camps. It's like, if you don't have these political beliefs or these religious beliefs, you're the enemy or whatever. Yeah. So it's very polarized in many ways. So having people take you at face value, does that always come easily for you? Or are there times where you see their guard is up and how do you overcome that? Like when people question your motives, or like, why are you really here?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm just really like honest about it. Like I've definitely had people be like, oh, like you're just here because you get paid, or you're just here because it makes you feel good. And like I would say like yes to those questions. Like if someone like really wanted to know the answer, I would be like, yeah, there's definitely a part of me that is here because it's a job and I need to pay the bills. There's a part of me that's here because being altruistic feels good. And there's also a part of me that's like here because I actually really give a fuck about you. I actually really care. I actually care what happens to you like today and tomorrow. And I'm not always in that zone for sure. But I just think like for me, I have to be really honest about my motives. Like first of all to myself and to others. There's like it's gonna be complicated as to like why I'm here for sure. But I think like there are plenty of days where like the core motivation is like I need to show up for these people. And I think it's one of those things too where like I see it as I think people who work with people can potentially develop a real ego about like I'm like super important and like I need to be here, like I'm the difference. And I think on some level, that's kind of hilarious. Like we think we're like that important, but then I also think it's a huge paradox because I think that some of the most important moments I've had with people were like really subtle, but on that particular day, it was really important that I was there. being able to have that conversation or being able to have any sort of impact came from like 100 days of like showing up, kind of being like, why, I'm not really sure why I'm even here today. Like no one, you know, this person doesn't really care. You know, I'm not really sure I care today. You know, and just like showing up, maybe we're just cracking jokes, like whatever, maybe we had conflict, I don't know. But there was like 100 days of that before there was any sort of anything that I would view as like quote unquote meaningful. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question about like motivations, but it's really complicated, and I'm kind of walking that line between like it doesn't really matter that I'm here, and also it's like super important that I'm here. Yeah. But I'm not really good at knowing like when those moments are, so I might as well just show up, right, do my job, try and be kind, you know, and see what happens.
So you work hard to be authentic and to make a difference with somebody. It has to be two ways. Like they can't just be BSing you and telling you what you want to hear. So. And obviously there's times anyone, whether they're on the street or anywhere, we all present ourselves a certain way, want to make a certain impression, want to manage the other person's impression of us. So what I want to get at is like, do you think you have I'm sure you have really good intuition when someone is like just trying to give you a certain impression, or they're just trying to give you the answers they think you want, and they're not really being real. They're not really thinking about what they need to do in their life to make a difference, right? They're just trying to tell you what you want to hear, or what they think you need to hear in order to get the money or whatever, you know. Yeah, totally. How do you get through that? Like, how do you get them to buy in that sense that they can make a difference in their life if they take it seriously, or if they really believe in themselves? Isn't that a big part of it? Like you just have to make them believe in themselves in a way?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Totally. Yeah, I think like I don't know if other people are able to do that like initially. I've seen some people who are really good at like calling people on their shit like right off the hop, and it seems to make a difference. But for the most part, I feel like that doesn't really work most of the time. I feel like most people who come in here would just say exactly what you need, what they think you want to hear, or what's been like something in the system, like if they've been raised in the system, like what's kind of been like the buzzwords that have gotten them through things. It's like a skill. It really is. Like there's a real intelligence to it of like knowing what to say, when to say it, kind of thing. I'm like constantly like amazed by it, and I think I kind of like credit that on some level, like that ability to say what you need to say to get whatever service you need. I think the beauty of a place like this, and some of the other places I've worked at as well, is like you get to go beyond that, hopefully. But you have to put in the time, and you have to show up in that relationship. And like I find usually, I've actually found like one of these guys that I've worked with now for the past 5 years, I would have said after knowing him for a year that I knew him. I'm like, okay, he's real with me now. Like I know. And then 2 years in, I was like, nah, I was wrong. Like, but now I know him in 3 years. And it's just kind of been like a pattern. That's interesting. Where I'm like, I don't, you know, now I'm like, I don't know. I think I know him, but like, I'm not really sure, you know. But as that relationship has like evolved, there's been more and more honesty, and more, I've kind of been given that space to call things out or to challenge narratives and stuff like that. But I feel like you have to have a relationship. You have to show people that you actually care, because part of that system as well is having a lot of people who are also very fake towards them, and who pretend in that moment as well they really care about them, but then the next day they might not, or they're too tired to give a fuck on that particular day or whatever it might be. And so they're also responding to that, of like that they've constantly had these interactions with people that, you know, have gone nowhere, or like that they felt they can't extend that trust anymore. And so I think that there's like a lot of just showing up in that relationship before you actually get that place to, you can say things in the meantime, you can challenge things in the meantime, but I don't think it's going to make much of a difference until they actually know that you're here, you're sticking around. For better or for worse, I'm here again today. You have to deal with me. You know, I don't have to deal with you. I think that's like really important. So I don't know if maybe you can just challenge that like right off the bat, but that's not something that works really well for me. Like I really need to show them that I'm here, I'm present, I'm being real. and then like maybe I have the opportunity to say something. But at the end of the day, I really want it to be something they want to do, and not something that I'm like, it'd be great if you did this. Like, that would be great. That would make me happy. It's really important to me that it's something you want to do.
That makes a lot of sense. And like you said, people are complex, and sometimes you think you know them, and then they surprise you or let you down.
Yeah, totally.
That happens, and we all put on personas. I mean, just think when you're a teenager and you act one way with your parents, and then as soon as they're out of the picture and you're with your friends, you're like, oh, my parents are so lame. They have no idea what's going on. Let's go do what we really want to do. Like, I told them what they wanted to hear. Like we all do that. And so naturally, these young people do that with any support system around them. They'll say what, sometimes they'll just say what they think. A challenge too, though, is when you tell people you care and you want to help them or whatever, sometimes they'll put demands on you that you can't meet, right? Like, it's like, well, if you care, then you'll do this for me. Sometimes, do you feel that there are expectations on you that this organization can't meet, or that you personally can't meet? Does that happen?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that's always going to be a thing for sure. And I think like part of it sometimes is like, what have I done to create that expectation? And I know that I have at times where I'm like, I have accommodated here and accommodated here, and that it's not actually a huge leap for you to think that I'll accommodate here as well. But that's actually like too far for me, or that's too far for the doorway, or whatever it might be. And so like, I always think like, what am I accountable for in that interaction? Like, how have I made it? So there's an expectation that exists here. And I think that's always going to be like a part of it. Like, working with people, you're just going to be working in the gray, and you're going to make those kinds of mistakes where you're like, I went too far. Like, I promised this, and it led to this. And so now I need to like set a boundary here. So I think that that's part of it. I'm like, I've probably done something here, and I need to work on my own boundaries. So that's a me thing. But then also that's a you thing. Like, it's not fair for you to make this demand. And so I always think there's like a part of it that's my own actions that's kind of set that expectation. But I think it's really tough for people who do this work, because I think a lot of people come in with like a very caring heart.
Yeah.
And I think that's really beautiful, and it's really, really good, and it's a great place to start. But I think that at some point we stop like honoring ourselves and our own needs, and that gets like really dangerous, and that manifests itself in like a number of other different areas. And so I think that is something that people in the helping field like need to work on for sure, is being able to do that. But I think that the way I view it is, if you're trying to look at it as like a human interaction as well, like you're hopefully not going to allow somebody to take advantage of you, or allow somebody to be like tyrannical over you. And I think that if you can't think about it in terms of like, if you can't care about your own boundaries and how you feel, because that can be a thing too, where you're like, it doesn't matter what I think, like, I need to be here for this person, if you are a Christian, like, what would Jesus do, I totally understand that mentality. But it's also like really bad for the other person to consistently like meet these needs and not hold them accountable, and not make them have to do it themselves. And so if you're actually trying to help somebody, quote unquote, it's actually really complicated what that looks like. And part of it is like, if you're actually going to help this person, you're going to be like, no, like this can't happen. I can't do that for you. With all respect and all love, like that can't happen. And that's actually, I think, much more difficult than just jumping through whatever hoop they need you to do. So if you're actually thinking about that person, like if you can't think about yourself, then think about that person, and are you actually helping them by doing this? And I think often we're not. It's just easier to meet this like surface level need, or jump to whatever hoop they want you to jump through in the moment, as opposed to do what actually needs to be done and actually help that person. So, which I think is tough. It's complicated stuff.
And I'm sure other places you've worked in here, and I assume with the volunteer training, they talk about boundaries, of course, about what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, things you can help people with, things you can't. You can't offer to let them sleep on your couch that night or whatever.
Although I've heard of people doing that for sure.
And I went through similar training, like in Victoria. I was volunteering with Victoria Parole, where we're mentoring guys who are getting released and from prison and trying to help them like reduce the chance they're going to reoffend, right? So I did that for 2 or 3 years. And a lot of the training was about the boundaries, about what's safe, what's not safe, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. You know, you don't give them a ride in your personal vehicle. You don't let them sleep in your house. Things like this. But it's not always comfortable setting those boundaries, right? Because it can be a shock to them and they can be offended or whatever. It's like where you set the boundaries, like saying, hold on, what you're doing right now is, you know, it's crossing the line. Or I can't tell, I'm not going to talk about, maybe they're asking you too many personal questions that seem kind of like, where are you going with that? And you have to set the boundaries, like, you know, that's private. Yeah. Which is tough because, like you say, people like yourself who are very caring and empathetic get into areas of social work where they're helping people. And then the person can feel like, well, you know more about me than almost anybody. And you're so caring. You're like my friend. Well, my friend would lend me money. Why won't you? My friend would let me sleep on their couch. Why won't you? My friend would give me a drive. Why won't you? Yeah. And it's sometimes you don't want to like break their heart or offend them or whatever. Sometimes where you say like, I'm not your friend, not in the same way that another friend is. I'm a caring person in a certain role, but I'm not your friend who's going to lend you money or let you sleep on my couch.
Totally.
And that's tough sometimes, right?
Yeah, it's like...
You don't want to disappoint them. It's like you're breaking their heart a little bit because they thought, it's like, oh, well, if you cared, wouldn't you do that? You know? Yeah. And you know so much about me. I've told you everything about... They might tell you about abuse they've suffered and horrible things, like things that are really hard for anyone to talk about.
Totally.
And then they're like, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's really... Yeah, it can be really brutal. It definitely... I have like some kids I know where I'm like, if they perceived me as a friend, like then I probably wouldn't be that bothered by it. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't be like, we're friends or something like that. But if they were talking about me as if I was a friend or something, I wouldn't be super bothered by it. Cause I'm like, I feel like I've known them for like a really long time. I don't work with them. You know, I might see them like I would see them outside of the context of work, and I haven't like worked with them in years, kind of thing. I'm not super bothered by it if they are like, oh, I'm like friends with this person. Like, yeah, sure. Like, you know, I would also still be like, I can't lend you money, or like I'm not gonna do things for you that are really bad for you. Hopefully, I would do that for all my other friends, where it's like, this is really bad for you. I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna do that. I hope I would have the ability to set those boundaries with like all my friends, you know. So in that way, I'm okay with those like previous relationships maybe being termed that way. But I think with like relationships, you have like professional relationships. I think it's like probably easier for me now than it used to be, because before it would be like, oh, well, I'm almost the same age as some of these individuals. And I guess there's some people here too where that's still the case, but I would have seen it as like a little bit harder to not have those like platonic vibes, since we're like the same culture, so to speak. But I think now I'm just more like, if I'm trying really hard to like honor that person, then I'm like, this person really doesn't need a friend. Like they really need somebody who's going to be like a mentor or like a presence or something like that. And like I have to look at like what is best for them, kind of thing. And like, this is what they need. Like they actually need somebody to say like, yeah, we're not friends. And like, that's not an unbeautiful thing. Like it's beautiful that we get to see each other and have these conversations, but then I also have this place in your life where I can call you out maybe, or I can say this is like not the right course of action. I can do things that a friend might be uncomfortable doing. And I think that's really important that you
have. That's a really good point. Because rather than seeing it as like you're somehow less than a friend because you're not willing to do certain things that are outside this boundary, it's like in some ways you're more than a friend, because like you say, you can have an objectivity and you can say things to them that would be hard maybe for a friend to say, but because you take your job seriously and because you have a professional perspective and not just a personal perspective, you can also tell them things that maybe would be hard for a friend to do, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's like I don't have the same investment in the outcome as like a friend does. You know, a friend still will have their own like biases and stuff like that. Or even they'll just want you to become something. Yeah. And that might be really good, but they have an agenda to a degree. I guess we all have that with like all of our relationships. Like we want this person to become a certain thing. And I feel like here we definitely want that, but there's less of that where we can just be like, what's actually best for this person? And you can take yourself out of the equation of like how it's going to benefit you or like how it's going to reflect on you. We're still humans. Those things are all present, but you less so, I would say. You have that. It's just a very unique relationship. And like, I think if someone doesn't view that as valuable as friendship, like that's fair enough, but I view it as just as valuable to have somebody in your life who would be able to do that for you. I wish, I wish I had people like that in my life where it's like they're not at all invested in me. They're just kind of like, I guess it would be a counselor to a degree, but somebody who can be there, who can jive with you, but then also has a responsibility to point out certain things at times. So.
Yeah, regardless of consequences, because normal people, they don't want to lose a friend. Whereas a counselor or someone working here, they can say, if you don't play by our rules, so to speak, then we'll help other clients instead. And if you're doing drug deals out front of their door, or you're doing certain things, or you're stealing or whatever, then we'll help someone else because you got to play by these rules. Whereas often with friends, you put up with things that you would just never put up with in a professional environment. Right?
Totally, you don't want to lose that friend. You don't want to lose that connection.
But you don't have, like you say, that investment in the same way. You can say, look, you play by these rules, within these guidelines, or we can't help you.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's really important, and it's just more like you can look at that and be like, what's best for this person.
Yeah,
it's not good for you to be able to go outside and do that drug deal in front of here.
Yeah,
like that's not. You can do it wherever you want, but it's not good for either one of us if that's the case. Like for a number of different reasons.
Yeah,
if you're being like rude to people in the space, like that's not good for either one of us for a number of different reasons. There's just you can be more invested in what's best for that person.
And if you're consistent and treat everyone the same, then they see the fairness of it, and they may resent it in the moment, but they respect it in the long term.
Hopefully.
It's a general rule. Like
totally,
if it's applied, like not just you, anybody who did that it'd be unacceptable. Yeah. Anybody who did that would be unacceptable. Totally. And they're like, oh, okay.
Yeah, totally. It's just like so healthy for all parties involved.
Yeah.
And not always something that I feel like people in the street culture have like encountered too much. And so I think it's really important.
Yeah. So tell me, what did you study in university?
I studied in university. I studied youth ministry.
Youth ministry. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So is that like a degree program, or what did you get?
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So it's a bachelor's of.
I ended up getting a 3-year diploma in. I think they called it like ministry and leadership at the end of the day.
Ministry and leadership, 3-year diploma from which college?
Ambrose University.
Ambrose University. Yeah. Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
And at that time, did you have a vision that you'd always want to work in like with organizations that help people? Like, did you always have that vision?
At that point, for sure. Yeah, that was the idea. I couldn't really imagine doing anything that wasn't involving like people, and being of service, I guess, to people in my community in some way. So, that would have been the intention. And obviously at that point it would have been like church kind of thing, but there was already some ideas of like, what would this look like if it wasn't just within these 4 walls kind of thing.
And in the future, what are some things that you could definitely imagine doing and some things that would be hard to imagine you doing?
That's a good question. I can imagine potentially at some point being a part of like my own project or a project with like other like-minded individuals, I guess. Yeah. That's definitely something that has been bandied about.
Like if you saw a need that wasn't being met and you could imagine it and you could see the people that could help you do it. Like,
yes.
That would maybe provide you that impetus?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's kind of, I think that the doorway, in my opinion, is like maybe one of the last places that kind of reflects like my view towards things, like my, I guess, like personal ideologies. I think that, and I don't really know if that's really super present with like most places that are like in this kind of work. So I think the way I kind of view it is I would love to be a part of whatever kind of reflects what I believe, but then if it doesn't exist anymore, then maybe I would have to do something different or do something more in line with like what I think to be true. So
Or one day maybe there'll be a community that has a need for something like the doorway, but doesn't have.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, some community, it's like, whoa, Kelowna has this huge need, or whatever city.
Yeah.
And it's like, if there was a program like the doorway, you could go start it maybe and meet that need in another community. This could happen, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's really important to me that this work continues to be like as human as possible. And I think that I haven't always seen that.
Yeah.
And I think it comes from like a good place. Like it comes from good intentions, a lot of things that happen.
Yeah.
But a lot of the things that we're talking about, like they go both ways. And like a lot of those interactions, they go both ways.
Yeah.
And that's like a very human thing, like dealing with conflict or setting boundaries or having difficult conversations.
Yeah.
Or challenging people to be better, or just walking with people or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
I feel like those things are like very human.
Yeah.
And once it becomes something where I'm the professional, I know better.
Yeah.
Let me dictate to you like how to live your life. You know, I think we've really lost like the humanity in that once it becomes this hierarchy. And I think hierarchy is like important. Like I think at the end of the day in this space, like it's important that everybody knows that somebody's in charge.
Yeah.
You know, that if things go kind of like squirrely, that like we do have like people that will step in and like dictate like what's going to happen next. Like that's super important, that we all need that to be safe. But I think outside of that, like these interactions should be like very human. It's super important to me that everybody that comes in here feels like seen and feels like humanized, that they're not tick on the box or something, or I don't know, like
see them as a real person.
Totally. I'm happy they're here and I want to treat them the way I would want to be treated. So I wouldn't want to be condescended. I wouldn't want to be treated as less than. I wouldn't want to be treated as a commodity. So, yeah.
So how would you hope that participants would describe you? What would you like to think that they say about you?
I would hope that they would just view me as like real, like very real. And I think I would hope that they feel like seen and appreciated by me. But also that I'm able to be honest with them. But yeah, I think like someone who like sees them, someone who appreciates them, and someone who can be like real with them, I think is like really important. If someone thought I was like fake or something like that, that would be tough. I feel like this guy's full of it. I would hope that they would think there's no bullshit. Or there's like very little bullshit, I guess.
Right. I think it's fair to say though that, I mean, nobody's perfect and nobody can always come across the way they want to. And also, no matter what, sometimes someone else is not in the frame of mind or to receive help or to trust anybody or to see anyone as real.
Yeah.
So if a participant were critical of you, what do you think they might say? Like, in other words, you know, I'm sure there have been times where you didn't come across the way you wanted, or they seem to be, no matter what you said, you got a negative response. So what might someone who wasn't satisfied maybe say about you?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Like, in other words, can you think of times where, I mean, again, we're all human, like times where maybe you were less patient or you were distracted by your own worries? You can kind of tell maybe they saw that you weren't fully paying attention to something they said, or things like that. Like,
I've absolutely been called out on that, where it's like, you're not listening to me. And And that's something where I like to think I'm like a really attentive listener. But on that particular day, it was just like, no, like I've got like 10 other things circulating right now. Which I really appreciated them saying that, because I wasn't even sure that they were listening when I would talk to them.
Right.
And then all of a sudden they're like, you're not listening to me. And I'm like, oh, wow, how the table turns here. Thank you. I appreciate that. Even yesterday, someone told me that they felt like they showed up at the doorway like around 5, and I was like, too late, you know, which is like entirely fair, and I definitely stand by it. But they were excited that they even made it to the doorway because they'd been like really struggling.
Yeah.
And they didn't even expect to do business. They just wanted more validation that they were actually there. Like, look at me, like I made it, you know. And I was more like, see you tomorrow. And I think they were hoping I'd be a little more excited that they even made it down at all, kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's definitely a thing. It's hard to know with like other things, just because when addiction and mental health are involved, like it's hard to know like how much of what's being said is like actually something you need to work on.
Oh yeah,
for sure. So that's kind of a difficult one to navigate for me.
Yeah.
I think about it a little bit more, like what would be the legitimate or the
some things that you might feel like you still are working on, like just
Yeah.
in your own terms of growth, because obviously making a difference for people and connecting with them in a real way is a big thing for you. I mean, that's like your life's like it's a vocation for you. Like that's you're always going to be involved somehow in connecting with people and helping them believe in themselves and use their potential, right?
Yes.
So, what are some things that you think that if you worked on or that would help you do that even more effectively?
Totally. Yeah, well, I think, like, first of all, my boundaries could be much better. Like, I've worked a lot on that, but I could have much healthier boundaries. That would definitely be a thing. I think that would serve, like, both parties more as, like, time goes on. So that might be something.
Yeah.
For sure. I think another thing is, like, attention to detail, like, being able to not, like, in various parts of the job, but like in terms of participants, like being able to remember certain things that were like important to them, being attentive to like details in the conversation. I can kind of get more like conceptual and not really be as concerned about these like little things. Where like Caitlin is really good at remembering like these little details that are happening in their lives. Where in my head I'm like, oh, it's irrelevant. Like, but to that person it might be super relevant. You know?
And they notice, right? It's like, oh, you remembered that.
Totally.
And it can validate somebody. It's like, because that's true for anybody, not just these participants. For any of us, someone remembers an important detail. And at the same time, if a friend forgets it, sometimes it drives me crazy when someone asks you something that you just told them like 5 minutes ago. It's like, 100%. And something that you thought was pretty important.
Yeah.
And they're asking you about it. You're like, I told you.
Yeah. Totally. It makes such a big difference.
Yeah.
And it's taken me a while to realize the value in that, because I've always kind of been like, but that person knows I care, because I might have forgotten that, but there's all these other things that like I remember kind of thing, or that I'm present or whatever it might be. But more and more I'm like, that's super important. And like if I could remember that it was somebody's birthday a few weeks ago, or I could remember that like this is going on with their pet or something like that, things that I'm really bad at remembering just in all aspects of life, I think would make a huge difference if I could do that more for the people that come in here.
Well, but I think if you, just by being authentic and real, they may just realize like, oh, there are some people who are like total like attention, detail oriented, and this other, and you're not. No, it's not that you don't care. Yeah. It's just that that's not.
Yeah.
You know.
I hear you. I try to just be really open and like, I'm sorry, like I just forget those things.
It's like I forget details of my own life, never mind your life.
100%.
Yeah, it's like
100%. And also like apologizing, like I'm so sorry I forgot that. Like that really sucks. Like I would want somebody to remember that for me. Yeah. I forgot it. I guess I'm human after all, you know, like I'm just not. So I'm sure there's many other things I could take a look at for sure, but I might have to think about that more. Yeah, I know in terms of like the job, like I definitely feel like there's lots of things where I'm like, oh, I could definitely like improve in this.
Well, 7 months is a short time in the scheme of things. It is. Like, of course, you're still learning in various ways.
Totally. And I hope that continues. Like, I hope it remains like, oh, there's like a tension here between what I know and don't know, you know, because I don't want it to get boring.
Yeah, that's just it. Yeah.
Challenging.
If everything was routine and not challenging, that'd be pretty boring, wouldn't it?
Totally.
Yeah. So can you tell me a little bit about other work you've done?
Yeah. So I worked at the Alex Youth Health Center for 3 years, 3-ish years, something like that. And I worked for Enviros at a housing complex called Chivery House. And actually like a lot of participants here, like maybe even like half come from them.
Oh.
So I know a lot of them from that housing complex, and I know some other ones from the Alex. I actually like kind of recruited some like when I got here, because I was like, oh, I get to see you again. Like, come on by. I'd love to have you.
Nice.
And then here, and I guess like some other like jobs in there as well. Like I worked for Assure, their child and family services essentially. And in like class, they're also associated with child and family services. So that would be like the relevant experience to hear. But I actually like, I always see like really common threads between like church stuff too, and like and higher organizations. So it kind of like in my head like can translate over at times, but in terms of social work, like that would probably be the most relevant. And Trevery House is, I think, like the first youth housing complex, at least in Alberta, that is also harm reduction. So that was like, it's kind of like, it's slightly like experimental on some level because it's the first one of its kind. So that was an interesting place for sure.
How do you think Calgary is doing, like in terms of helping homeless, and what do you see as how the doorway fits in with that, and you know, what else could be done? And I know this is a very big question, and it's not like you're the director here or whatever, and you've been doing this for 30 years, but you've been working firsthand with people, so you must have your own thoughts on that.
Yeah, totally. Well, and I think like too, like the more you potentially, not absolutely, but potentially the higher up the ladder you go, the more you kind of get removed from what's the street, so to speak.
Yeah,
or like
right.
Like the ground, whatever is like going down. And I think like I have a lot of grace for that, because I think that it wouldn't take me very long at all to get into a headspace where I would be thinking about the homeless population like a different way than I do right now. Like I think even someone like myself, I just feel like I need a constant reminder of what's going on, like why I'm here, and like what addiction really does to people, and all these different things. I think like a lot of society's narratives towards it are pretty easy to, there's some truth to that, like it has to kind of be balanced, but I think it's easy to kind of get entrenched in the other way of looking at things too.
Yeah.
So I think the further you get removed from it, someone has to make those choices, but I think it'd be good for a lot of people who are making those choices to do outreach like once a week or something.
Yeah.
Just kind of get a reminder of like what this looks like. I think like for myself, I think that it's definitely gotten worse over the past 2 years. We're going to get the official stats hopefully soon. But to just anecdotally, like just people I know, like talking about it, like what's been happening, the amount of overdoses that are going on, even like just kids I know who maybe aren't as much like street entrenched or still are, like they'll talk about it, what things are like now, how safe it is now versus how it used to be, things they see, kind of thing, encounters they have that they didn't really have before or didn't have with the same frequency. And then just for myself, just observing like downtown and stuff like that, it seems a lot busier, there's a lot more going on. Drug use is like much more open than it used to be. And you see people now in like areas you never really used to see people. Like I saw some homeless people in Country Hills a little while ago, and I was like, I don't think I've ever seen anybody up here before. Like, that's interesting. So that's just like anecdotal, like things that I'm seeing, and I don't really know what to like do with that. I don't really know what the solution would necessarily be, but I think like the narrative towards it. I think the narrative towards it right now is that like, how do we shift this so that people who are not necessarily part of street culture feel like safer? And that's kind of like the political push, is like, how do we protect our citizens kind of thing from these other people, I guess, which is not something I'm not super agreeable to that way of looking at things. But there's even a time where I went down with like CPS, and there was a politician who also came down the train, but their conversations were just with like the professionals and like the police. There was no conversations happening or engagement with any of the people, any of the homeless or unhoused, whatever term people want to use these days. There was none of that. There was no like engagement in that whatsoever. And in fact, they had like police with them, and because they were scared something might happen to them on their trip. And I understand that idea of like that something could happen for sure. But I think like that narrative in the city of Calgary seems to be like, it's not like how do we help people who are struggling with addiction. It's not even like, why are people like struggling with addiction? I don't really hear as many of those conversations politically. It's more like, how do we get back to things being like safe and clean again? And which is ignoring that there was a problem before, and also just ignoring that maybe the people there need to be helped potentially. That would be my thoughts and also my own biases, right? Like I'm sure not everybody is looking at it that way. I mean, the safe injection site or the safe consumption site, whatever you want to call it, like that was a political initiative that is definitely in line with the idea of like harm reduction and stuff like that.
Right.
But I think like over the past like 4 years, for sure, it's just kind of, that's really, the narrative seems to have shifted a lot more. So.
Now, it seems like every few years you hear in the media some politician or some other person will say something like, we're going to get, and I'm not just talking about here, but in other communities, they'll say, we're going to get rid of homelessness in the next 5 years or whatever. And now here's my bias. I think that's crazy when they talk like that, because it's like, even if you go back to the Bible, it's like the poor will always be among us, right?
Yeah.
The idea that you'll get rid of homelessness in 5 years, it's like saying, we're going to get rid of drug addiction in 5 years. We're going to get rid of alcoholism in 5 years. We're going to get rid of broken home, or whatever you want to call it, abusive homes in 5 years. We're going to get rid of deadbeat dads in 5 years. No. Yeah. So if you're not going to get rid of all those societal problems that make it more likely that someone ends up on the street, you're not going to get rid of homelessness. You can't just build enough apartments and put them in there. Because if you've got the drug abuse, if you've got all these mental health issues, if you've got all these other things, they're not going to last too long in that apartment. Yeah. There's going to be reasons that you're going to have to move them out of that place. So you're always going to have it. The question is, how much of it and how well do you manage it? Mm-hmm. And how well do you manage the mental health and the physical health and the safety issues around it? But you'll always have it because you'll always have flawed human beings who have the qualities that lead to it. Do you know what I mean? Like,
I completely agree.
So when they talk about we're going to eliminate homelessness in 5 years, that's idiotic.
Yeah, I know. I would 100%
like,
agree with that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's like
I've definitely felt that way. It's such a simplistic way of looking at it as well. Like it's,
and then you're setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where it gets like much deeper, right, than the work and the politics and stuff like that. And it's more about like the human condition and like what we're going to acknowledge and not acknowledge, you know. And I think that just starts with the individual, unfortunately. Right. Like what are my demons? What are my addictions? Like all those different things.
Yeah.
But you can't really have that conversation. It's more about like what is like the simple response to it. And it's like, well, if everybody got housed, like, we'd all be okay. Like, that's a hilarious notion.
That's absurd.
But some people would really benefit from being housed, right? Like, some people actually, it would be really helpful for them. Some people would.
Some would, some.
Yeah, but
if they're ready, like, it's crazy. Totally. If someone is ready and able to go to work, but they just need a vehicle to get there and they can't get one, or they need a house to sleep in so they can get a proper night's sleep and then get to work next day. Great, make sure that they get it.
Yeah.
But the fact is, there's a lot of people who can't even cope with that.
Totally.
And it's not solving the problem. It's like, oh, this person doesn't have a job. Let's just give them a job. If they don't show up the next day, they're going to lose that job. Or if they show up to that day and they take their paycheck and spend it on drugs, and then they don't show up the day after, they're going to lose that job.
Yeah.
So you haven't solved anything by just giving the person a job. No. And you haven't solved anything by giving many unhoused people simply a house. Mm-hmm. If they don't have the other structures and supports around them, if the mental health issues aren't being addressed, the drug issues, if there are those issues, aren't being addressed. So I think the starting point has to be, we're always going to have addicts, we're always going to have alcoholics, we're always going to have people who've dealt with severe trauma and abuse in the past, we're always going to have people with mental health issues, and those things, among other things, contribute to homelessness. We're always going to have it. So the question is, how do we have a society that meets the needs of those people and keeps people safe? And
totally. And it goes back to like the helping thing too. It's like for that individual, like this is like probably too nuanced, but it's like for that individual, what is like best for them? Like what is helping actually like for this person? Like some people would need to be like challenged and be like, I don't think, I think you can do better. Like I really do. Like I think you don't have to be one of these people who's entrenched in it. And other people, like, that might be it. Like that that might be their lives, and it is a matter of trying to make that as safe for them and everybody else as possible. But every person is going to have their own story and is going to be complicated, and like only God knows. Like basically, like whether they have the capacity to change or not. I have no idea. I'm happy it's not my job. Yeah, I don't have the ability to know those things for sure, but for some people that mean like we can't accommodate this, like because you can be better, like we're not going to accommodate this. For other people it would be like, yeah, we need to just make sure that this might be your life, and how do we keep you safe, keep the people around you safe. But yeah, it's strange. It's strange for me at this point to think that like just housing somebody, you feel like your job is done and everything's going to be okay. Alpha House was telling me the other day about how they came across somebody who they were called because the business owner didn't know how to approach the person who was like, I think, sleeping in front of their establishment. And so they called Alpha House, which I think was actually, like, if you're not going to go talk to them, I mean, that'd be great if you actually talked to them yourself and weren't, afraid of that interaction. But I don't have, I'm not going to judge that too harshly. Yeah. And they also called Alpha House as opposed to the police, so that's really awesome.
Yeah,
not as persistent trespassing or something like that. Yeah. So there's a lot of good things there. But then they went and talked to this person. They're like talking to him, like, "Oh, do you have somewhere to go?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, like I have a place." Like he just wanted to be outside. Like he doesn't want to be in his apartment.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I saw that with another guy I worked with, where like he had an apartment, but he would leave for like weeks, and he would be camping out by the river, and he would come back.
You would not expect that, right? Like the average person would think, "Oh, he must not have a place."
Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly. But like you're used to living your life like one way, and there's like a comfort in that, or maybe your community. Like that's where your community is or whatever. It's deeply complicated. And so just to say like you've got an apartment now, you should be good to go. Like where are these issues coming from? It's kind of hilarious to me. And I'm not saying people are necessarily saying that, but that idea kind of seems to be, kind of subliminally there, right? Like we just got to get people housed. The 10-year plan, to prevent homelessness or stop homelessness or whatever it was, like that will solve things. And like you said, you still got a lot of people who are dealing with all these different things, and they might not even want to be housed.
I really wonder if inherently like government's incapable of addressing a lot of these issues, and that they can allocate resources. They can obviously build apartments and allow for that, or provide incentives so that other people can do it and whatever. But the actual like work one-on-one in terms of determining the needs of people, what specifically for this individual do they need at this time? I often think it's like organizations like The Doorway and others that are best suited to do that, because government is great, like I say, about they have the resources, tremendous power and resources to allocate, but just by their nature, they're slow moving. They can often be very unaccountable. The people who are making decisions are often far removed from the people being helped. All of these things that make them unable to address the fact that here's a person who maybe could be working tomorrow if they had some clothes on their back, if they had somewhere safe to sleep tonight. And the government can't, it's like maybe in 2 months something will be directed to, what I mean? Like it's, I feel like to a large extent, the government needs to get out of the way. They need to like provide the resources to organizations that are able to respond quickly and uniquely like to one individual on a one-on-one basis, get to know what their needs are and meet those needs.
Yeah.
That's what I feel.
I would, that's...
Because otherwise government's like, fill out this form and then this goes to someone else and then maybe in 2 months something will happen. But by then, 2 months could be a lifetime, like in terms of what this person's needs.
Oh, yeah.
Like...
Totally. Yeah, absolutely, yeah. It's like, it's almost like purposefully inefficient. Yeah, almost. You see that with people like wanting to get into treatment, where they're like, I would go to treatment tomorrow, but there's like a 3-month waiting list,
Right.
And then by the time you might be willing to go to treatment again, like 3 months from now, like you could be A, dead, or like B, like you're like, fuck that.
Yeah.
I don't know what that sober person was thinking. Like I'm enjoying, like I'm, now I'm super entrenched in this again. It's like you kind of got to catch it, like when that wave is there. And so those things are like really frustrating to kind of see that. That is the beauty of places like The Doorway in some ways, is that you can't solve like the larger issues, but you can solve like the clothes and the food and stuff like that. Some of the basic needs, some of those like connection pieces. There's things we can do in like real time to help somebody today, which is like really, really cool. But there's still like limits, right? At some point, you still have to reckon with like the system.
Yeah, to some extent.
Yeah, and that's why I see it more as like, kind of like what I said earlier, like I don't really know, I don't have the power to make those choices. I don't even know if I want the power to make those choices. I don't even know if I'd make the right choice. But what I can do is like, I can show up for this person today, and I can honor their humanity today. and who knows what will happen tomorrow. But it's almost a relief to me that those larger things are outside of my control. But I can take care of these like basic things and treat you as a human being today.
Yeah.
You know? And like maybe that can like shift something for you, or maybe like, you know, several months of being treated like that, like helps you see your self-worth or whatever. I don't really know, but I think that those bigger things are outside of my control. It's just a matter of like, what can I do today in this interaction, you know?
Can you also think of things that participants have told you that just meant a lot, that when someone said to you about like what difference it made talking to you? Or
yeah, I think just mostly people like really appreciating that I listened more than anything.
Yeah,
that's like a huge part of it.
Yeah,
these problems are like way too big to solve. Like, you know, and so a lot of it's just like listening and being a presence and validating.
And why is that? I mean, it might be obvious, but why do you think that is so important to them? Is it because they just feel so discouraged and unheard and unseen? Like they kind of feel tossed aside by people in their past or just society in general?
Yeah, I think that's probably a big part of it. Like a lot of people might consider those problems not valid because of the circumstance that led to them. Like they would kind of view it as like, well, this is like your problem and you've made a lot of choices to kind of create this problem, which is true. Like, I would never in that interaction be like, oh, you didn't, like, this is not your responsibility. Like, it's like, yeah, no, like, you know, if you ask my opinion, like, you definitely made some choices that kind of like led to this for sure, you know. But I think it is just like listening with like empathy. And I think like for me, like linking it, I usually try and link it kind of like to shared humanity, where it's like, well, of course that choice was like difficult or you made that choice or whatever because like shame, because guilt, because society, because all these different things, like it makes sense. And that's not saying that you're not accountable for that choice, no. You know, but also like I have experienced like some of those emotions and I have made great choices, and like you're very human for making this choice. You know, like you're not actually as separate from society as you think you are, because you're very human and you made a very human choice, and now it's fucked. But you know, that's what human beings do at times. So welcome to the human race, you know?
Yeah, right.
Making that choice. But I think like that is like, I think the listening and the empathy is really important.
That means a lot to you when they say to you that, like, thank you, you're like a really good listener, you helped a lot telling you this. Like, when they tell you that kind of thing, it
does mean a lot, but it can also be one of those things we were talking about earlier where like people say what they believe you want, you know? And so, like, I think that it's often can be genuine, but if I don't know somebody very well, and you're kind of with the bullshit meter too, you're like, I don't know if I'm getting the full story here. And they're like, oh, you're so great. It's kind of like, maybe, but like, maybe you just want me to, maybe, you know, look this way and not the other way kind of thing. And like, we'll see as time goes on, like, you know, the first time I like challenge you, or the first time that I set a boundary or say you can't do something or whatever, like, will I still be that great in your eyes? Like, there's struggles ahead on the horizon, you know? Yeah. So it's not that I don't take it seriously, but I think that it can mean something, or it can be part of like them saying what they think you want to hear. It kind of depends on the situation, but I think it's almost more like the subtle things that really, like, for me, it's like when somebody comes in and they intentionally like say hi to you, or it's like some of these guys that I've known for like a number of different years where they just like, they might mention something in passing and you can tell it's like tough for them to say, because it's not like a manly thing to say. It's like, oh yeah, like I really appreciate that when you did that or whatever. And it's like, you know, I think those are the things that really like stand out to me. It's like the really subtle things. Getting a high five on the way out. Somebody goes out of their way to be like, yo, like catch you later or whatever. Yeah, somebody hasn't really talked to you that much and they end up like talking to you. It means they maybe been like observing and they're like, okay, this guy's like potentially safe. You know? I think those things always like stand out to me, even more so than like hearing the explicit, like, you're so, you know, such a great listener. Because like I appreciate that, but I don't know what place that's coming from. And some of those other things, you can tell they come from a place of like, I don't really want to say this, but like, I appreciate you, bro. Like, you know,
when you're told something you don't believe is true, do generally overlook it, or is it more effective to call them on it? Like if someone says, for example, I haven't used drugs in a couple of weeks, but you can tell they're like jittery and they're withdrawal from you probably using drugs that night before. You know it's not true. Is there like advantages and pros and cons of either way approach? Like to say, really, is that really true? Because the way you're acting right now doesn't seem consistent with what you're saying. You know what I mean?
That's such a great question. Yeah, I really...
Because then you lose credibility in their eyes. Because don't you look like a chump if you're like, oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
And it's like, and he's thinking, man, this guy's
this guy's so easy to fool.
He's so easy to fool. So you want to maintain your own credibility and respect. How's he going to respect you if you just seemingly accept their lies?
Man, that's a good point.
It's a tough call, right?
It is. I think like part of it, it's kind of like two different conversations, I guess, because part of it is like I'm fortunate enough to know a lot of the participants here from like previous times, so that I have a better feel for like those particular relationships and like when I should say something and when I should keep my mouth shut, because there's definitely times where like it's very obvious to everyone and their dog that this person's like lying, but it's not the right time to like say something. And then there are other times where I might even just be frustrated and just be like, that's like, what are you talking about? But I try really hard to kind of pick my spots on that, and I don't want their interaction with me to always be one where I'm like calling them on something. Yeah, for sure.
I wonder if there's a tactful way, like almost a script that we can learn that's to say, well, why don't we just set that aside for now? In other words, you're not either accepting or rejecting what they just said to you, but just say, why don't we set that aside and talk about this other thing for now? Yeah, you know what I mean. And then maybe you keep your respect.
Totally.
You know what I mean? Maybe there's a way. Yeah,
I've definitely done that where I'm like, oh yeah, well, anyway, like just kind of move on. I actually say like interesting a lot because I find it's like a very neutral word.
It's non-committal. It's not saying necessarily I accept that or I agree with you or I believe you.
You can take it any way you want. And if somebody is like in a certain frame of mind, I might be like interesting, like, what's interesting about that? And I'm like, okay, that's good. Like it means that opens up the dialogue to like, okay, like actually what I meant by that is like, I think you're out of your tree today. But I think most of the time, like people kind of take that any way they want to. But it's very like neutral and kind of non-committal. So if someone's obviously, very high and they're like, oh, I've been sober like 5 days. I'm like, oh, interesting. And then kind of shift the subject. I'm not going to, I certainly wouldn't want to be like celebratory or,
right.
Yeah. Like act like I'm
totally buying into it.
Yeah, totally. I do a lot of like saying that or just kind of like, just not even saying anything and letting that person kind of move on. Like when it's their time, they'll probably come forward and be like, I was like, they probably wouldn't say hi. They'd probably be like, I was tired or like I wasn't myself yesterday. It's kind of like, I know. Like, I'm aware. Yeah. But if you wouldn't have those interactions like afterwards, it might be different. But I'm fortunate to know some of the people, and then we're also fortunate as a team that we'll probably see them at a future date that we can kind of be like, hey, like, so last time when you came in, like this was what was going on.
Do you have a specific job title? Did they say, what your job title is this?
Yes.
What is your specific job title?
Youth Engagement Coordinator.
Youth Engagement Coordinator.
The official.
What technically, like, if you were telling someone we're hiring for a youth engagement coordinator, what are the specific, like, you're responsible for this.
Yeah. And right now it's kind of strange just because we don't have as many staff and stuff like that. So like what I do right now is like usually a job that would be taken over with like that Jacqueline would have been doing, or like we've kind of just kind of like those tasks have kind of combined a little bit. But typically it would be that I would be doing outreach by myself or with like not by myself, but like for the doorway. Or with other organizations, so like doing street outreach and stuff like that. And then another part would be creating and cultivating like relationships with like other agencies, and trying to make sure they're aware of the organization, and so that their clientele or their participants can also be aware that we exist, and if that's something that would be helpful for them, they can come on down and see us. And then I guess the other part would be just being in space here and contracting / running pay table which I consider probably like the most important part is just like being present here every day. That'd probably be how I describe it at this point.
What's it like to meet a participant for the very first time?
They usually come when it's like super busy. So I'm like, oh, okay. This is like other thing I have to do. But yeah, I think like I'm usually pretty excited. I think it really depends too on like what kind of state of mind they're in. Like sometimes people come in and you're like, oh, okay, like I don't know if this is gonna be a good fit, and you kind of have to navigate that conversation. But I think like I'm often like, oh, this person seems really cool. I'd be excited to have them like in the space. I'd be excited for them to have the opportunity to make some money, and it sounds like they have some ideas of some ways they might want to like shift some things in their lives. So I'm usually like pretty excited, but it really is hit and miss in terms of like how that process will go. Like some orientations are just like a blast, and you're just like, man, I hope this guy comes back tomorrow. Like we're really vibing. That was great. And other ones you're like, this is like tough, and this is going to be a different kind of conversation with them. So but generally, like pretty excited. Especially excited when it's somebody I've met, like say on the street that morning, and they come here. I'm like, oh great, like that's amazing.
What are some warning signs? Like sometimes would someone come in and say right away, like, so how do I get my money? What do I need to fill out to get my money? And that's all they want to talk about is like, get money now. Yeah. Or maybe they seem to be on drugs or something. Yeah. Are these some of the things like signs that this is not going to work out well?
Yeah, totally.
That can happen?
Yes, absolutely.
They just see it as like a scam, like, how can I get my money right now? And that's all they want to talk about.
Yeah, if someone's like super into the money, you're like, all right, that's
not the right
to really deconstruct.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally.
Some other warning signs, obviously if they're on drugs or alcohol or whatever, that's a really bad sign.
Yeah. I think for me too, it's like if you're having a conversation with them and they seem to be like low acuity, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to be able to participate in the doorway, because like I've seen some kids where I wasn't really sure, and like they've definitely improved as the process has gone on. But there's definitely an element of like, if you're talking to somebody that don't really seem to really comprehend like what you're saying.
And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're on drugs or alcohol right there. They just may... What's causing that? Like, what do you mean when you say that? Do they? Yeah. You mean they have a mental impairment? That they,
totally. That's exactly.
Like it's 100% of the time that they have a mental health issue. That they could have schizophrenia. They could have whatever.
Yeah. I guess if someone's like talking to themselves and stuff as well, you're like, oh, I don't know. But even then we have like some kids in here who will start like talking to themselves, but they're able to participate in the process. They're able to have like conversations with us, and it never really seems to. I've seen it like way worse. So. Like that bad, but I think it's more at the end of the day like that if you're having trouble engaging in the process, like if you don't have the bandwidth to think about goals and to break down the steps, and like I think there's a fine line between somebody who might just like struggle with the idea of that at first because they never had to do that, and then they become someone who's like really proficient at it. And there's like another side of it where there's other people, and I don't know how to describe it really, but they just don't have the capacity to engage in that process. Like they can't think of anything, they can't really write down the steps to it. There are just unfortunately some people where they can't grasp it.
Really?
Yeah.
They just can't think in like a linear, orderly way of like this action would lead to this result and I need to do this. They're just kind of swirling around like in their life in general, like in their thoughts, and
that could be one way of describing it. I wish I could communicate it better, like what that kind of looks like in practicality, but it's really just like they would have like a goal where like some people even can't distinguish between maybe like a to-do list and like goal setting. They might never make that leap where they understand like, oh, like even like the future thinking and stuff like that might not really be a thing. And I do think unfortunately there are some people where like their reality is just going to be like they're just going to kind of be here, like they're going to exist kind of thing. And there might not be like much else they can do in terms of what the world would view as an accomplishment. So it doesn't mean that their life has to be not worthwhile or anything like that, but like what their expectations are for what they can accomplish and what's realistic is actually like can be pretty low.
Can it happen sometimes though that it's hard to engage them in the contracting process and because of those issues you're talking about, but they do want to come here and hang out and and to take advantage of the resources, but they can't engage in the contracting. Does that happen sometimes where they want to be here, but they're not engaging in the contracting process? Then do you just let them hang out then? Or you say, look, we're here about taking steps. And
yes, that would be the conversation.
This isn't just a social hangout place. Like,
there's a bit of a tension there in terms of like people will come here when they don't have any business they can do, and they will just hang out.
Okay.
And we're just kind of trying to decide like what does that look like? Like what are we okay with? Are we okay with somebody like being on their phone for an hour in the corner? Like, is that okay? Like, I don't know. Like, what happened last night? Like, are you like super tired or are you trying to get away from something? Or I think it's like it can depend on the individual. But we do have people in here who are not doing business and are still here. We're trying to make it someplace where you come and do business. If you're not doing business, then you are applying for jobs. You're making phone calls or whatever. You're probably a little more quote unquote productive. But there are definitely people who come here just to hang out, and I think there has to be for that. As long as you're not being destructive. I think there's one guy right now, like he just recently became homeless and he's staying at a shelter. And so like he's been doing some temp agency jobs, but then there's some days where like last night he said the night before he didn't sleep at all because of some things that were going on in the shelter. He got like no sleep and he's like, I'm not going to go to temp today. Like I just need a place to go. And so I don't know, here like all day. And I don't really have a problem with that. He's not really doing anything, but at the same time, like it's good to have him around. He's not doing anything destructive, and there's a reason why he's here as opposed to not working that particular day. So, but we wouldn't have somebody be here who's not doing any sort of my plan work or not doing any sort of contracting whatsoever, and is a participant here. That just wouldn't be a thing at this point. So you'd have to be engaged in that process on some level. Because at the end of the day, the intention is still that it's a place to do business and create that link between the street culture and being a part of mainstream culture at some point.
With all the young people you've seen that have ended up on the street, is there like one main, like most common factor that make them go on the street? And is it intrinsic to them or it's something that happened to them?
We've got great questions, Dan. No, they're really good. It's a fine art. I mean, it's both, I guess, because it's like most of those things that are now like intrinsic are because of the things that happened to them. Right. Because of trauma on some level. So it would be a bit of both. But in terms of like what informs it, a lot of the time it would I mean, if we wanted to go super deep, we'd be like trauma and society, like stuff like that. But I guess like the short answer would be probably like mental health and it manifesting itself in addiction. Right. Yeah, if you knew nothing about someone, you just see a young person is on the street, sleeping rough. They're really homeless. And you think, okay, you haven't met them yet, but what would you most likely suspect about them? Yeah. It's like, if I talk to them and I learn about them, most likely you'll learn that they dealt with some form of abuse perhaps in the past. Yeah. And that they then coped with it through addiction. Yeah. And perhaps their friends became their real family, and then they succumbed to the peer pressure of the bad things their friends were doing. Yeah. Because they felt a sense of belonging with their friends. They got into substance abuse, which helped with the emotional issues. So that's what you'd suspect. It would certainly be something along those lines. Yeah, definitely along those lines. Yeah, the trauma and then like the addiction and then like kind of like not really having a life like after the addiction. Like that's the kind of the way I see it, is like there's this like point where it's like, oh, and then you started drugs and it's just kind of like that's just your life now, and not in like a dismissive way, like not. But there seems to be a real through line between like the kind of person that they were before they started doing drugs. And the person that they are now, which is like someone who just like their life just revolves around that essentially. Yeah. And then I think when people get sober, it's kind of like the same thing, right? There's like the person they were before they got sober and the person they are kind of like afterwards. Yeah. That'd be the biggest thing. Like, childhood trauma. And then I tried this, and then that was pretty much it. Right. And then they lose their support systems because they're stealing to get money for the drugs. They're lying to people. They're betraying family and friends and everyone. Their family disowns them because... Or their family is a big part of their addiction. Or the big... maybe the family has their own issues. So totally. Their mom drinks like more than they do. Yeah. Like, oh, God. Right.
And I guess if you work in any area of social work with vulnerable people, you're going to deal with, there'll be times when you'll lose people to addiction. Mm-hmm. They'll die from addiction. They'll get knifed because they're in a bad spot, or get killed that way, or they commit suicide. I had a neighbor who I think he had undiagnosed schizophrenia, and he ended up hanging himself. He's our next door neighbor. Ended up hanging himself in his own basement 2 or 3 years ago, and he had a wife and a young son who's the same age as our son, but his paranoia got worse and worse, where he thought like the neighbors were jumping from house to house on the roof and spying in his window, and then they put microphones and cameras in the attic, and that the neighbor was following him around. Like, he called me up a few days before he killed himself, saying to me, the neighbor is like following me behind me. He's in this, he named the model of the car. He's like following me right now. And he says, isn't that crazy? And I said, well, if your neighbor is following you, that is crazy.
Yeah, that's a good way to frame it.
If is using a lot of work in that sense, right?
Yeah.
But I said, yeah,
that's
they are.
That is pretty crazy. Yeah.
But no, I saw him 2 or 3 days before before his mom found him in his basement of his home, and he had hanged himself, and you wouldn't expect it, right? And he was somebody who, up until recently, had held down a job, and he had a son who he was very, loving towards and all of this, but he had this paranoia that the world was out to get him, and he felt, I think at some point, that he was a burden to his family rather than a benefit, because his wife and kid had moved out because of his, went to stay with relatives because of his decline, and I think he was just feeling very defeated and all of this, and we'd been very close friends with them for years, visiting them all the time for barbecues, and they would come to our house. It was shocking. And just think, so if he's got a house and a wife and a kid and supportive parents, and he can get to that point, I can just imagine how vulnerable some of these folks are, and how close they are to feeling despair, that there's nothing to look forward to,
Oh yeah, totally.
That's heartbreaking. How do you cope with that? Because if you're a caring person and you're getting to know people, but you also know that you have no control once they're away from here, and that you could lose them.
Yeah, totally.
How do you care without opening yourself to the pain or disappointment or hurt?
Totally. I think for me, it's really important that I recognize that I'm not responsible for what anyone does. Really. Yeah, I'm just not responsible for that.
Yeah.
And what is going on with the people I work with, it goes way beyond me. There's so many things that happen to them, and it's kind of in the same way what I was saying before. It's really important that I show up, that I see whoever comes by here. And there can be a small interaction that I would think is nothing, but meant something to them. And I don't exactly know how to explain that paradox exactly, but I really do view it as something where it's it's super important that I'm here, but then also it doesn't I'm not the answer. I am far from the answer.
Yeah.
I'm another flawed human being dealing with my own stuff. I don't shoulder that responsibility for what that person ends up becoming, and what choices they make.
Yeah.
I think when people end up ending their lives or overdosing or whatever, I think I'm very okay with feeling the pain, because I would like to be as open as humanly possible to feeling that, and also I want to be open to also being able to feel the amazing highs when somebody was able to overcome something, or didn't kill themselves, or didn't use today or whatever. I want to be able to feel those things as well. And so I think that then you do risk feeling it a lot when someone ends up passing away. Yeah, but I think relinquishing the responsibility for what they do really helps for me. And I do think everyone who does this work is fighting a much larger battle than just addiction or something like that.
Right.
Without making it too philosophical, I think there's forces beyond my understanding. And I think what I view a big part of my job is regardless if I have a voice in that person's life at that point or not, I just kind of view it as combating narratives, combating the things that they have going through their head that say something about them that I don't necessarily think is true.
Mm.
And I kind of view it as like I'm just kind of creating like the other side of things. Like, you know, like that could be true. However, I don't think so because of this, because of that kind of thing. And I think, you know, obviously there's lots of like science and stuff like that to add to the conversation about why we seem to like hate ourselves on some level sometimes. But I think like there are moments where I'm just like, yeah, there's definitely a darkness in the world, and some of those things just go beyond my ability to combat, and people are sometimes going to succumb to that darkness, and I'm not responsible for it, but I'll do everything in my power when I have them there to combat those narratives, to present a different side of things. But it goes beyond me at times.
Yes. But it's funny to hear you talk about like I totally get where you're coming from, because you talk about not taking on that responsibility, that knowing what your responsibility is and what their responsibility is, and that you can't take that on. But you do take on a lot of responsibility, because I've worked with plenty of people who all they think about is, how am I going to move ahead in my job to get a bigger salary so I can buy a nicer house or bigger whatever. And they don't think about the problems in society, or at least they try not to. They are focused purely on themselves and their own enjoyment. Oh, I want to go to a nice restaurant. I want to make lots of money. I want to buy stuff. And they're not thinking about the dark side of society or the people who are suffering. They are truly not taking responsibility for others.
Right.
So for you to talk about not taking responsibility for others, the very nature of your role is about responsibility for others. So what separates you from those people who are just concerned about their salary and getting a big house and having a certain image of success that's all material?
Yeah.
What makes you the weirdo?
Yeah, well, there's no doubt about that. Well, I think I still think I'm super privy to a lot of those narratives. Like, I think everybody is. I definitely feel like I have like plenty of moments where I'm like, how am I perceived? Or, you know what I mean? Like, I think that's just always going to be a part of it. And there's like a reality of some of those things too, where it's like, oh, you know, like I'm sure for yourself, like you have to think about those realities of like how much money, and like you've got a lot of responsibilities. And I actually really admire that, and especially admire that you've decided to like follow your passion in the midst of that. Like, I've got a lot of respect for that. I think that's really cool. And so I think like I'm definitely still privy to those things too, without a doubt. And I wouldn't want to present myself as like not being susceptible to that. I think that probably like my background has a lot to do with that. I've just always thought about the world in like a way that is like beyond like what we can kind of perceive right now, or like what's in front of us. And I couldn't very easily define like what that is for me at this moment. But I think that I've just always kind of seen things as like there's like lots of messages and like narratives like heading our way, and there's, where do those lead? You know, they don't seem to lead to our benefit. And so I would like to like not follow them as much as I can. And then like if I do follow them, like where do they lead me? Like not to a great place. And so I'd like to not do that again. It didn't work out very well for me the first 5 times, like maybe number 6. I'll learn the lesson. I think that probably just comes from the kind of like more that religious background of like that it's about something bigger than yourself. And whether that's like heaven, hell, you know, all these like eternal realities, whatever, people have different views on that. But I think for me, it's like, it can just be about your community, or it can just be about your family, or whatever it might be. And a lot of that's just like selfish, because when you step outside of yourself, you feel a whole lot better as well. Like it's actually a real relief to think about people other than yourself. And so there'll always be that part of it too, where it's like, I feel better about myself when I'm thinking about things that don't just involve me, when I'm thinking about the other person. And then there is always going to be that part where I feel like, you know, I'm not sure what it is, but I think there's something bigger than myself. I think there's like forces of good and forces of evil, and I feel like the evil is like pretty obvious probably to most of us. Like we feel like something isn't really right, and if you drive through downtown, you're like, okay, like there's something amiss here. And so I think I just want to be on the side of good, whatever that is.
So you're living consistently with your conscience, fair to say?
Hoping to, trying to.
Staying away from the bad and focusing on the good as much as possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's just more for my benefit. Like, it's not to win any awards or anything. It's just kind of just...
It's what you need.
It's what I need.
Yeah, for your peace of mind. And,
totally.
Yeah.
Totally. I would really struggle to not do that. It would just feel like inauthentic at this point. So, yeah. But that's why it's really important for me to be honest in that process too, and kind of be like, like sometimes I do want to just like get a higher paying job, or sometimes I don't want to talk to people, like, or sometimes I have like narratives towards our clientele that would reflect like narratives I don't like. Like, I have plenty of those days as well. So
sure. Yeah. Cool. Thanks, man.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate you taking the time.